Today on StampTV, I'm going to show you a clean and simple card project that can be left plain or embellished with buttons using white embossing powder and plain old water-based markers. Let me show you the tools and products you're going to need to do this project. First, you're going to need some stamps. And I'm using some of the stamps from the new Shabby Spring StampTV kit from both the Warm Spring Wishes and the Spring Blessings stamp set. Then you're going to need some VersaMark or other watermark embossing ink. I really like VersaMark for this process. You're going to need an embossing magic pad. This is an anti-static pad and it removes static from the surface of the card as well as any oils that might transfer from your hands so that embossing powder only sticks to the ink and not anywhere else on the card. Then you're going to need some embossing powder, and I'm using some of the Stampendous fine detail white powder. You're going to need some water-based markers, and I grabbed a couple of my Marvy markers. These are the Les Plumes 2 markers in jungle green and pale blue. But you can use any kind of water-based markers, memento markers, Stampin' Up! Markers, even Crayola markers. Now, I wouldn't suggest using Copic or other alcohol markers for this because you're going to be coloring over white embossing powder. And believe it or not, the alcohol markers are so great at sticking to non-porous surfaces that they'll stick to the embossed areas, and you want them to not stick to the embossed areas. So water-based ink is better for this process because then you can just wipe the excess away and there won't be anything stuck to your embossing, your embossed areas. For cardstock, you're going to need some Kraft cardstock. Now, although this doesn't come in the Shabby Spring StampTV kit, this is one of those staples that most people have in their collection. If you don't have Kraft, you can use a tan or a pale brown. Anything like that will work, as long as it's a lighter neutral. Okay, so to begin, I'm going to rub the anti-static pad over the entire surface of this piece of cardstock. And this particular piece of cardstock measures 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I'm going to start with my biggest flower from the StampTV Shabby Spring kit. And I'm going to ink that up with VersaMark. Now, clear stamps work very well with VersaMark ink, so you won't have any trouble with that. I'm going to start my first one down here in the corner, and I'm going to stamp it just a little bit off the cardstock. So it's very difficult for you to see but on camera, but in real life you'll be able to see the watermark, so it will be easy for you to stamp the rest of your flowers. So I'm going to add a couple more of these. I'm going to add one here and one up here. Then I'm going to add some of the bigger leaves that go with this flower. So I'll put one leaf here. Let's see, we'll add one right about here. Let me tilt that up a bit. And we can add one over here on the side. Okay. Now my next step is to take the smaller flower and I'm going to fill in some of these areas. I'll put one down here. One right over here. And then one up here kind of in the corner. And then I'm going to grab the smaller version of that leaf and I'm going to add some leaves to those smaller flowers. Put one here. One right in there. I think I'll put one over here coming in from the side. And maybe one right down here. Okay, so now I have my leaves and my flowers all done, And then I'm going to, I'll use a little Post-it note for this. I'm going to sprinkle some embossing powder over the surface of this card. And the nice thing about the VersaMark is it stays wet for a pretty long time. So you can do a lot of stamping before you actually have to worry about the ink drying. I usually use a piece of folded cardstock, but I don't have one ready to go. So a Post-it note will work just fine. Now, if you see an empty area that you think you would like to have another stamp, like maybe right in there, you could add one. I think I'm going to just let that go, though, because I kind of like a little bit of empty space on a clean and simple card. So now I'm going to put this embossing powder back into the container, and then there's a little bit left there. Using my Marvy heat tool, I'm going to heat up this white embossing powder. And you'll notice that when you're heating the embossing powder, it's going to get a lot brighter white. So it'll look a lot more vibrant against this neutral cardstock. But it is a good idea to use a fine detail powder for this because the flowers have a lot of fine little lines in them. And we want to be able to get into the spaces in between. So if you use regular embossing powder, those lines might swell up and you won't have the detail that you would have had if you used the fine detail. All right. Now we have all those beautiful white flowers done. Now I'm going to add a greeting, and the greeting that I've chosen is the Spring Blessings greeting because I want this to be kind of more of a generic card that I can send to anybody. However, for a card like this, if you don't know what you want to do, you can just hold off and do your greeting later, or you can make a series of them and make some birthday, some thank you, some get well, and then you'll have a nice collection to grab when you need them. Okay, so I'm going to add the greeting right down here at the bottom. And then once again, add a little bit of embossing powder onto that greeting. I like to do the greeting afterwards, just because I'm not 100% sure what's going to fit once I finish my flowers, and I want to make sure I have one that looks good. All right, and so I'll emboss that. And again, the fine detail powder really does help when you have this kind of delicate font. Okay, so now we have Spring Blessings ready to go. Now here's where the water-based markers come in. And again, you can use any kind of water-based markers. Another thing you can do is if you have something like a Dove blender pen or a Niji water brush, little paintbrush, you can use re-inkers. So if you wanted to use the Gina K Designs re-inkers, you can color with those as well. They're water-based, and this way you can match your cardstock to your ink. But I found these two colors and they look pretty good with our cardstock, so I'm going to use these just to show you. So now my next step is to color, and I'm going to use, I have a brush tip on this end of this marker, and I'm going to color in all of these flowers. I want to show you how pretty they look when they're colored in. It's almost like a stained glass effect. The white really has a huge impact on what these flowers look like when they're done. If you had embossed these in black and tried this same process, it just wouldn't have as much power and vibrancy when it's all colored in on the darker cardstock. Now if you're using a light cardstock like our ivory or our white, then you can do this with the black embossing powder, but it will just be, you know, it'll just look very much like your regular coloring. So you could use just black ink too. I like the raised texture of the embossing powder for these clean and simple cards. And you can see I'm just kind of brushing in there, not going outside of the lines. And that embossing powder helps you not go outside of the lines because it kind of holds the ink in place. And you may want to grab a tissue or a paper towel because there will be some ink on the surface and you'll want to wipe that off. I'll just do it with my finger here, but you can see how vibrant that's starting to look, especially as that flower gets more white toward the center because the lines get closer together. And you can do the same thing with the little ones. I'll color another little one and then I'll show you how the leaves look colored. And try different colors of markers. Try colors that you wouldn't think of for flowers, like maybe a soft gray or a pastel green. And just see how it looks against the Kraft cardstock. It's really quite exciting how vibrant this all comes together vibrantly. And then again, once you've colored over the surface of this, you do want to take a paper towel and just wipe away the excess. Now, I'm going to color in the center here. I did go a little bit inside the lines, but I want to color in the center of this one just to show you what that would look like if you added color into the center. So that's what it would look like if you added that color in there. Now for the leaves, I'm using this jungle green. This is a darker green. And I like the way it looks up against the white. But you could also try a real pale leafy green, maybe our grass green. You can also use our ink pads if you don't have the re-inkers, just by kind of squeezing the pads together and getting a little bit of that ink onto the lid and then using a paintbrush to grab it. So there's lots of ways to get color that's water-based to use for this project. You can see you can just color the whole thing and don't worry about being fancy about getting it on the lines, because again, it'll just wipe right off. See that? Wipes right off. So you can see what this looks like. What a fun technique. Let me show you my finished card project. And in my finished card project, I embellished the centers of the flowers with buttons. You can do that, or you can leave them plain because they certainly look beautiful plain. Here is that finished card project. I love buttons, and I have lots and lots of the Gina K Designs buttons, so I really thought that this was fun to add some of the Turquoise Sea buttons to kind of coordinate with the Turquoise Sea Card Base. And then this little layer of brown that you see is our charcoal brown. And both the Turquoise Sea and the charcoal brown come in the StampTV kit. So if you haven't had an opportunity to try those colors, this really looks pretty all together with that Kraft cardstock. So that is my finished card project. Try embellishing these flowers with glitter, brads, eyelets, stickers, and more, or leave them plain for a clean and simple, easy to mail greeting card.